You are listening to Processing Trauma Out Loud, conversations about trauma and healing from two women who are doing the work.
Hey everyone, this is Kandace and Sher with Processing Trauma Out Loud. Sher, it is so good to be back together. It's been about a month since we recorded. We had episodes already recorded and ready to go, but I have missed recording with you.
Me too, Kandace.
Yeah, it's good to be back. And we're going to tackle a topic today based on something that you and I have both observed about really kind of what's been going on in our communities and friends and people that we're connected to. And that is the topic of there's a lot of people just in seasons of pretty deep grief, going through different types of losses. And this is also happening at a time that I'm getting ready to launch my grief workbook. And you had mentioned maybe, do you want to talk about this today? And I just think it's such a worthy topic to talk about. Grief and loss, and where's the hope, and what do we do in those seasons?
So important. And I think we also talked a little bit about how we're moving into autumn and how for a lot of people, autumn is, and in our world, in our physical world, autumn is that season of slowing down and the leaves on the trees die and all of our plants growing in our garden die. And we're surrounded in our physical world by this sense of death and dying. And I think for many of us, autumn is the season of the year, kind of historically or cyclically, where we do tend to feel more of a sense of grief anyway, where the losses, the major losses of our life can just feel heavier in this time. Kind of paradoxically, schools start in the fall, and a lot of times programming begins in the fall. And so there can be almost this contradictory feeling of here we go, we're launching, we're starting something new, and yet we're in this place where our physical world is shutting down and preparing for winter. So there can be kind of that conflict that we feel because of that. And I think that actually we feel that conflict emotionally too. It's like so often I will hear people ask the question, why do I feel this way? Or why am I feeling this so heavy right now? I do believe that it does have a lot to do with the season. And so I felt like it's just really timely that we talk about grief and loss and touch on some of these things again, because when we have experienced childhood trauma, we have so much grief and loss just in our stories that might not have anything to do with actual death, the death of a person or the loss of a person, but the losses that we experienced because we didn't have what we needed, and that there was just that kind of innate sense of loss. So we're kind of going to be a little bit diverse here today, but yeah, just a worthy topic to discuss, I think.
Whether it's just meeting with a friend or working with a client or really reflecting on my own story, there's this sense of, and I think everybody pretty much is in agreement with this, grief is not something that we fix. It's really not a problem to be solved. It is an emotion, it's a process that we go through when we are mourning over someone or something that we've lost, which is going to apply to everyone. And, bringing up for those of us who have experienced childhood developmental trauma, one of the things that I've been more curious about my own story and the story of others is looking at how do people experience going through grief and loss. And for those who, maybe were looking at their journey and thinking, gosh, this just seems maybe easier for them, or maybe someone that they're like, wow, this is just all consuming them. I do think, okay, as a child, you did have little losses. Maybe you had major losses. Maybe you changed schools. Your dog died. Your parents divorced. Someone that you love physically died. As you're developing as a child, your belief systems, your brain, your body, however that experience was met with your caregivers will give you the messages about what it is or how grief looks. So if your grief was shut down, not seen, maybe shamed, you're going to struggle with that as an adult. But if you were seen, right? Maybe your dog died and your parents moved towards you and cried with you, or maybe you had a funeral or you did a little ritual and your grief was honored and it felt safe to cry. It felt safe to get angry about it. It felt safe to question about it. This is making me emotional because that's how I want every adult to be able to feel.
Hmm.
And that's why I wrote this grief journal.
Yeah.
So if you're 50 years old and you don't understand why grief feels so impossible, I want to hear your stories.
Because when we hear someone's story, and especially when we hold it with them and help them contain it, it allows them to come from this space where grief can feel very threatening and very unsettling because we don't know how to hold it to a place where we can feel safe as we grieve. And that is something that I think we need help with. I don't think that our human capacity is such that we can really grieve in isolation.
Mhm.
We have to have someone walking with us in some sense in order to really do the grief process.
It's been several years ago, but my husband and I were watching this documentary, and I don't remember the name of the football player. Maybe somebody does, but it's a story of a football player who had a lot of tragedy in his early childhood. I want to say maybe his dad died, and there was just lots of losses. Well, he was this great football player, and he ended up getting scholarships and playing professional football, but he ended up because of all these emotional issues with anger and depression and acting out of that, basically being written off as this horrible, rebellious person. Now, you and we say this all the time. Of course, there are behaviors that are going to have consequences and need to. But what they found was this football player ended up in prison. And I remember just crying through half of this. And the more people started drawing near to him and the counseling that he was getting, he had so much unresolved grief in his body that even though he was talented on the football field, he didn't have what it took, right? To just go through, like if you get hit and that's something that happens in football, his anger would get the best of him. And I just feel like there's so many stories out there like that. Can we, like, what's going on under the surface?
And I'd like to ask you, Candace, and this is putting you on the spot a little bit, and I do want to talk about your grief journal too. So we are going to get there. It might actually be in the next episode, but I want to ask you this question because you have such a heart for the grief process and for people who are grieving. And you have so much compassion for people who are in this situation. And I'd like to just ask you, what do you feel that you are able to offer another person, and whether this is family, friend, client, we're not, it's about another human being. When you sit with someone who is experiencing some level of grief, what are you offering them? What does your presence with them offer them that they would not have if they were alone?
I immediately went to my little girl. So I had a mom who had a lot of grief, a lot of loss, and it came out as pretty deep depression. And I sat with her a lot. I just sat with her. Of course, I felt helpless. It wasn't my place to care for her, but of course I loved her. She was my mom. And yet, through my journey of healing through childhood trauma, I've also had to allow anger come. I believe that this started when I was a child. And then, as I began the death of my dad and then going through the healing of childhood trauma, Like, I think I've been really offering people the gift of full presence. Now, as a child, I didn't know what to do with that. And I didn't, I really didn't have the tools that I needed, but I still was offering myself to be present. That's what someone needs. They just need someone that can be fully present with them.
I want to pause you there because I want to ask why. Why? What is it about someone being with them in a way where you are fully present? What is it that you're really offering there?
So you're offering acceptance just as they are. You're not bad. You're not wrong. You're not crazy. You are worthy of being paid attention to in these deep, dark, painful emotions. Depending on what someone's messages are about themselves in those spaces, if they don't have the gift of someone's full presence where they know, like, oh, this person really sees me, they're with me, and they're not turning away or telling me there's something wrong with me or I need to get over it. The training that I went through, one of the things that this lady said, like, she's literally trying to get the DSM changed in various ways for those who are grieving. And not, I'm not going to say no one ever needs medication, but she said her program is set up that we don't medicate people's grief. And I'll never forget that,
Mm.
because that's what I ended up doing with mine.
You medicated it?
Well, yeah, through various coping behaviors, yes.
Right. Because why?
Because it felt too much.
Mm.
And I didn't have the eyes of someone's full presence and acceptance. Why my grief was valid and worthy to be witnessed and cared for.
And I'm wondering if you can name a few things of when your grief felt like it was too much. And we're particularly, I think, talking about the loss of your dad here, right?
Yeah, I mean that
Okay.
in later life. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember my first loss, and that was a dog
Yeah.
that was my companion.
Yeah.
And it was met with,
Mm.
he's happier now because now he's living in the country.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Gosh, even as I said that, I feel like my little girl, if she if she could have had words back then, she would have said, "Okay, I'm glad that he's happy, but I'm not."
Yeah. And how did she have to cope, right? Like, how did she medicate herself to get through that because she didn't have help?
Yeah, well, I think initially just it's when the angry part started developing.
Yeah, and I think I want to just have you name this too when you said when we're going through our grief and it seems like it's too much to bear, that then we turn toward medication or we turn toward some kind of coping behaviors because feeling the feelings is just too hard. But can you just name what are some of the things that people feel just overwhelming, or some of the ways that people feel like something is wrong with me that I am feeling this so extreme?
It's a really good question, Cher. I think that varies, but I know that I think one of the hardest things is you don't always have the language for what you think is wrong. It's more of this prevailing sense that it's just not going to be okay. And I would say for me, where I go in that is fear. I quote C.S. Lewis in my grief journal. He was the one who said after his wife died, I never knew grief felt so much like fear. And it's this sense of what you thought was to be true or what you thought would never change has changed. And what does life look like moving forward? Now, with my dad, he was older. It wasn't so much an untimely death, although he could have had many more years if it wasn't for the cancer. But for people who lose people in an untimely manner or in a very traumatic, tragic way, it shocks the human system to the core.
I want to make a comparison here about how even the loss of a friendship can feel extreme. We're talking mostly here about the loss of a life, but we have these other losses too. We have losses of relationship. Sometimes we have losses of wellness or aspects of our body that just aren't functioning the way that we had in the past, and there's loss there. Or there can be other kinds of losses too, where we feel a similar type of fear about how do I go forward in the future. This isn't what I expected. Life has changed and I'm not quite sure how to handle this.
I mean, it's just real. I know after I'm going back to my dad dying, but like, I've had friendships end too. So I think we have to remember the loss in itself is painful. It's going to be painful for anyone. But the messages that we tell ourselves or that have been told to us in the loss is usually the culprit for how we're going to be able to hold that loss. I recently, a few years ago, lost a friendship. And I had to really, I wanted to move on really quickly, honestly.
Mm.
And it was in the slowing down. I was like, okay, what messages am I telling myself about this loss?
Shame, or there might be messages of guilt.
Yeah. So I think if you can have, this awareness, and if you have a guide, my book is it's a very simplistic guide. It's not real extensive, but there's just 3 components that can break it down and give, like, I do have practical things that people can actually do. I have journal questions and quotes, but it's really about if you can just slow down a little bit
Yeah.
and learn to be with that grief.
Yeah, and let's come back next time and talk more specifically about the journal. I think it's such a fantastic resource. I haven't even seen the whole thing yet. I can't wait, but it's such a fantastic resource for people going through grief. And so I would like to come back and talk about that in our next episode. But just as we wrap up this more kind of a general conversation about grief and loss and what people experience and how the presence of another can be really impacting, anything else that you would like to say before we wrap this episode up, Kandace?
Yeah, I do. I want to say being in story groups has helped me so much in being a witness to the different ways that people grieve. And yeah, just having one-on-one is great too, but there's been something about that. I remember watching you in deep grief one time. And I mean, there was times I felt like I was holding my breath. You had so many reasons to feel the deep grief and the deep anger. And I was just holding that like, oh, I'm expanding right now in my ability to be in a very deep place with anger connected to grief.
Yeah, I just want to reaffirm that story group and being with others who are doing this journey is so valuable. So, Kandace, thank you for just sharing these thoughts with us. And I'm super eager to come back and talk about your grief journal also and your workbook. And just thanks for sharing your thoughts today with us, with what some of your experiences are of being with others, because it is so helpful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Love you, friend.
I love you too.
Thank you for listening to Processing Trauma Out Loud. Make sure to check out the show notes for links to suggested resources and social media. Like, subscribe, and follow to keep up with our weekly content. And if you don't mind, take a moment to rate and review us. Your feedback is extremely valuable and contributes to the success of this podcast. One last thing. If you have found this podcast helpful in any way, or if you have questions on how to take the next steps on your healing journey, please reach out to us via email at KandaceSher@gmail.com. That's KandaceSher@gmail.com. Our sound engineer is Jeremiah Jones of Auditory LLC. We welcome you to join us for more conversations soon. Take care.